Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, bonjour.
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Ambassador Nestor Astorio, President of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I call to over the joint meeting of the Second Committee and the Economic Council at our 68th session. Ambassador Osorio, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this joint formal meeting of the Second Committee and the Economic and Social Council, which will look at the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals and finding ways to promote sustainable development. Distinguished participants, at the dawn of the 21st century, member states adopted a visionary Millennium Declaration that reaffirmed the fundamental values of human rights, the need to end extreme poverty, respect nature, and promote shared responsibility. The Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, which were adopted following the declaration, galvanized governments, civil society, business, and other actors around the world to tackle extreme poverty in all its forms.
Now, to get right down to business, we will be listening to our panelists. We have 5 distinguished panelists, and I'd like to thank them, first and foremost, for their willingness to come, give us their time, share their experience, knowledge, and time. Mr. Paul McMillan, Global Industry Leader, Public Sector of Deloitte Touche Tohmatsu Limited. Mr. Parag Gupta, Founder of Waste Ventures. Ms. Tokumbo Ismail, Co-Founder and Managing Director of Lethia Capital. Mr. Luther Ragin, President and Chief Executive Officer of Global Impact Investing Network. And Mr. Joseph Verbeek, Lead Economist of the Development Prospects Group of the World Bank. To give us guidance, to help us as we advance, we also would like to welcome Ms. Sade Balaringwa, Emmy Award-winning news anchor of WABC TV, who is obliged to be the moderator for the panel discussion this morning. We're in your hands. You have the floor.
So much, and good morning to everyone today. And first of all, I'd like to thank the co-chairs, His Excellency Ambassador Osorio and Ambassador Diallo. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have a robust discussion today. And thank you for convening this joint meeting. This is going to be, I hope, engaging, informative. So without further ado, I'd like to thank everyone, first of all, for being here today, and it is a pleasure to be here. The topic of today's discussion is at the heart of the UN's goal. Of course, the entire world looks to the UN to lead the international community in meeting the developmental goals that were set in 2000, known as the Millennium Development Goals. And setting the ambitious agenda was one of the UN's most important contributions. And I know that many of you are already striving to achieve some of those goals, but the reality, achieving them is not easy. There are development challenges that are being faced by communities in many countries around the world, and it is at this point that the world needs commitment, perseverance, and perhaps most critical of all, innovation. And that is the focal point of today's discussion, thinking outside the box to move the needle in solving some of the world's biggest problems. And so much is changing in the world right now, and certainly how things are getting done. And the model itself is twisting and moving, evolving and transforming. And there are new innovators that are closing the gap between what governments provide and certainly what citizens need. And there are multi-billion-dollar markets forming around some of the world's toughest problems, from fighting malaria to providing low-cost housing to educating the poorest of the poor. Rising new players are stepping up, helping to solve just these massive problems that are out there. And one of these players include the likes of the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, whose annual grant-making budget is more than $3 billion. And they're looking at age-old problems with a fresh and unique approach that is spurring innovation, and governments need players like this. Speaking of innovation, you're going to hear more about global business leaders are standing next to governments as partners. And one business leader doing just that, communications mogul Mo Ibrahim, selling one of his companies for $3.4 billion and using its proceeds for philanthropic purposes. And governments have to keep this in mind. Traditional official development assistance and national welfare policies are part of the solution, but they cannot alone resolve the world's most intractable problems of the environment, poverty, lack of education, and poor health services. We need a solution revolution, and the panel is going to help us try to find that. And I have to say that I'm really looking forward to this, not just because I'm moderating this, but I read through this book, and I think it is quite fascinating. You're going to hear many examples, which I drew upon in my opening remarks. So if you haven't read the book yet, you can see them all along here, so make sure you grab one. And I have to say, I think I had a few aha moments, and hopefully you will have your own today. There are many examples that are going to be given about people, companies, foundations, philanthropists, and what they're doing to change the model in solving the world's problems in the 21st century. Paul McMillan is going to talk about what happens in the solution markets, where...
Am I going to hand it back to you, or you're going to hand it over? Yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Sade. Thank you. Thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Parag Gupta, who is the founder and CEO of Waste Capital Partners that operates transparent, environmentally friendly solid waste management that employs the poor. Previously, Gupta was an associate director of the World Economic Forum in Geneva, where he was responsible for the search and selection of South entrepreneurs across South Asia and Eastern Europe. He's going to speak today how they made waste into an industry. Mr. Gupta.
Esteemed co-chairs, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the opportunity to offer views on how social entrepreneurs can accelerate the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. I'm pleased to share with you a bit about our firm and what we're doing as a wave maker that's not only creating a new business model, but then also trying to create a new ecosystem of solving one of the world's most pressing issues, solid waste management. To give you a bit of a context to the problem, I'm sure many of you are aware of the growing epidemic of waste, but to provide perhaps a little bit of a local context, where I work primarily in India, urban waste in India every week constitutes the weight of approximately 2 Empire State Buildings. And this is growing. I'm sure many of you have seen this issue, perhaps in your own countries. Now, approximately out of that, only about 60% is collected, and often the only processing that's being done is by waste pickers, approximately 1.5 million in India. But these issues are not only found in India. The World Bank estimates there are over 120 million waste pickers worldwide, or people who make their living off waste pickers. And by waste picker, I mean, next slide, those who make their living picking through dump sites to collect plastic and scrap, perhaps making less than $2 a day. We find waste pickers anywhere from developing countries and also in developed countries as well. This is a pretty common informal sector job. Now, how are we going to tackle this issue? Next slide. What Waste Ventures does is actually work with municipal governments. Municipal governments actually spend anywhere up to 50% of their operating budget on this issue. It's enormously pressing for many municipal governments, yet that same amount that's being spent means that often there are intransparent governance issues related to the expenditure on waste management. So how do we tackle this? We work with progressive municipal leaders and progressive state leaders to implement systems where we train their municipal staff to do the doorstep collection. We then take that waste, hire waste pickers to process it to form compost out of the organic waste and recycle the dry waste. Best of all, we do this all free of cost to the municipalities and to the governments. Instead, the way we make our money is by selling the compost to local farmers, setting up those marketing channels, as well as selling the recyclables. In such a manner, we're able to triple the income of the waste picker, reduce 80% of the waste that would otherwise end up in a dump site festering, releasing harmful methane and CO2 equivalent gases that contribute to climate change, and do it at a fraction of the cost of what a municipality would normally charge. We've started to do this with state governments, where we're now working with 44 municipalities in Andhra Pradesh, or slated to start with 44 municipalities in the state of Andhra Pradesh of 85 million people in India as an example. We've now started spreading to Vietnam and other countries, and this shows how governments are in fact partnering with social entrepreneurs to be able to solve some of the most pressing issues. Now, we might be able to handle 60 or 70 projects in the next 3 years. But if I look at a country like India, where we work with smaller cities, that is only a fraction of the cities that need it. And without another solution, the 3,000 cities that require this aid, and perhaps the many thousands that need it all over the world, will not be able to find another solution. We can't be the only provider of this. This is why we're also creating an ecosystem. How do we do that? Next slide, please. By capturing data. By capturing data, demonstrating what works from the ground level on a handheld device, taking those metrics around collection, around composting, pushing that out into a back-end system, and then pushing that out to other waste enterprise solutions. Often private companies talk about creating barriers of entry to protect their IP, to protect their innovation, and to maximize their profit. What we're actually talking about is destroying barriers of entry and encouraging others to come into this space with us. Only then can we solve these monumental issues. With that in mind, if we're able to achieve this, we'll be able to solve many of the Millennium Development Goal issues, from eradicating poverty to reaching environmental sustainability, facilitating private sector use of technology, and even promoting gender equality and combating diseases common with the spread of waste and disease. From this, there are a few takeaways that I would ask of you as we are looking at how we accelerate Millennium Development Goals. Next slide, please. The first is providing tax incentives to social enterprises within your countries. We see the effect this has had on not-for-profits that are able to promise tax deductions to foundations and to philanthropists. A lot of this work is already being done within the third sector, from recognition of multiple different legal entities that show a maximization of social impact over profit, to intermediaries such as Ashoka, the Schwab Foundation, Echoing Green, and many others that identify social entrepreneurs that can assist governments in that nature. Second one, please. Second, we found that the role of municipalities is best served, and the role of governments was best served when there was regulation rather than implementation. Perhaps failure is one of the best ways in which we learn. One of our first failures was trying to implement a project with a municipal government where, because of demands that were made in an intransparent manner by them, we were unable to fulfill what they wanted. Now I look at the kind of system that we've set up now with progressive governments, where no money transfers between them to us, and that helps facilitate a less risky environment. Instead, there's regulation around the need for environmental processing, which then we can fulfill. Third, please. Related to that, often we find that money is not necessarily the answer to everything that's required. As I said, we're able to implement our systems at a fraction of the cost, and we found that sometimes money within these systems was almost like trying to douse a fire with oxygen. It only inflamed the issue further. And I'll give you an example. There was an urban renewal mission that was launched to provide money to many of the larger cities to build the capital expenditures or to build the capital equipment that were necessary for solid waste management. there was money spent, but there was very little to show of it, and there were very clear reasons as far as that money was spent. Instead, what we found is we can build low-tech, low-cost, low-skill solutions that create employment for low-income individuals. And finally, the last point I touch upon is creating incentivizing financial instrument structures for products that serve the basic pyramid, for products that serve those who make less than $4 a day. After all, if car companies can have financing mechanisms and financing arms that help provide low-income or low-interest loans to purchase vehicles, why can't we do the same for treadle pumps, for drip irrigation systems, and for solar power? I will stop there and pass the microphone back. Thank you.
Parag Gupta, thank you so much from Waste Capital Partners. You guys are doing just really incredible things. And now I would actually like to open the floor to any questions or comments. I hope you guys have a few. But first I'd like to invite Mr. Mark Neo, Deputy Permanent Representative of Singapore, to respond to the many things that the panelists had to say today. Mr. Neo.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, for giving me the floor. I would like to thank the President of ECOSOC and the Chairman of the Second Committee for convening this meeting. I thank the panelists for sharing their experiences, in particular Mr. Gupta and Ms. Ismail, very, very interesting experiences. And I thank our friends from Deloitte for sharing their Solutions Revolution and the book that goes along with it. I think it's...
And thank you for your comments.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much to the President of ECOSOC, el Presidente de la Segunda Comisión.
Chairman of the Second Committee. We'd like to thank you all for organizing this event. We too think it's very important. My name is Milagros Miranda. I'm Counsel of the Delegation of Peru to the United Nations. This event is an opportunity to say that we are beginning to work within the framework for the post-2015 agenda. So the idea is how we can achieve the Millennium Development Goals. What has been said is very timely, opportune. In a report of the Secretary General on number 8, Global Partnerships, great concern is expressed over the fact that little progress has been made in this development goal. Reference is also made to the fact that, regrettably, there's great reluctance to make any changes. How can we achieve this goal? That's the question. This question is particularly relevant because we've heard from everybody that there have been benefits from private investments, to have social impacts, to have benefits to the environment. I think we can all say that we're well aware of these flows and the benefits from these flows. The private sector plays a significant role. We need it. We need public-private partnerships. We need innovative machinery. Others have said this, not just for the MDGs, but the SDGs and the post-2015 agenda. But let me ask this. If we haven't made progress in this area now, what have been the major problems, the major obstacles? It's been said that the government has the role, the job of creating an enabling environment, an environment that is favorable, that attracts investments. Yes, others have said that there are incentives as far as taxes are concerned, as far as leadership is concerned, as far as regulations are concerned, which could attract investments. But above and beyond that, what other types of incentives could the private sector create so that these partnerships would be more efficient? Others have also spoken about the question of data revolutions, the need for more information, data-driven problems. What type of influence could the governments have here so that we have better monitoring, if that's the right word, to find out how things are really going with the participation of the private sector? Should the government have some role to play in this area? Should the government check and make sure that all these activities that we're talking about are really benefiting the community to a great extent? We do talk about the private sector a lot. We have to be realistic. Businesses are businesses, and there's always an economic benefit here or there. But what's going on behind all this? What's happening in the wings? We can't deny that much is going on there, but how can we make sure that things are more efficient? How can the government operate more efficiently? How can it monitor the results in the interest of the community? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that those were great comments and certainly great questions. Who would like to tackle this? Okay.
I thought I could volunteer for a few comments, not only on this question. Actually, I would like to come back later also maybe to what the delegate from Singapore said and the delegate from Venezuela, because I think they are very, to some extent, related. But
and now I believe Mr. Gupta would like to respond as well. I'll come to you right afterwards about some of the comments today. Mr.
Great, thank you. First, to give a concrete example on how exactly we can further create partnerships or incentives, I'm actually really excited about the Global Partnership for Output-Based Aid, and as Luther Reagan mentioned, social impact bonds. To put that into context of what we do with solid waste management, one of the big problems right now is often contracts which are either provided by the municipality, paid for by the state, or even we see a lot of development aid go towards urban infrastructure, is based on tons collected and often dumped. Now, what we would be very excited about and what we're trying to work with governments on now is there are very simple tools that can be measured and then either put in bond format or otherwise assistance being provided when certain metrics are being met. For example, measuring the number of tons that are actually collected, measuring the number of tons that are composted, measuring the number of tons that are recycled, as well as, one of the key things we track, of course, is for the waste pickers and those laborers, what is the increase across the baseline of their wage. So all of that is very clearly measured and aligned between the environmental, the social, as well as the economic incentive for all parties involved. So if the firm's making money or not depends on whether or not they carry out these outputs, and if they're not, then the government has a very clear, definitive way in which they can stop those services. I'd also say that the overseas development aid and the assistance provided by bilaterals is actually not mutually exclusive from everything that's mentioned up here. As a matter of fact, Waste Capital Partners and Waste Ventures, my firm, received a lot of its initial seed funding from a very important initiative launched by the Swedish International Development Agency called the Innovation Against Poverty grant. And that was at a time when the idea of trying to tackle what's often a very corrupt industry with a brand new model was entirely too risky and much more on the impact side for even impact investors to go into. So without that bilateral aid that was provided to us, we would have never gotten off the ground. And that was absolutely critical at a time when no one else would come in. And perhaps foundations would be able to play that role, but foundations are often limited to the nonprofit sector. So that role that was played in providing grants or even providing low interest income, low interest debt is critical to getting organizations and firms like Waste Capital Partners and Waste Ventures off the ground to create the enormous good that we can in the social and environmental impact sector.
I think that is it with the comments. Did any of our panelists have anything else to say based on the comments given today? Yes, Mr. Gupta, you wanted to say something else?
Yes, so just to address the last point in terms of competing resources, to bridge Luther's comments to the practitioners. I mean, the practitioners in between can really be that conduit between what may be perceived as limited resources and the resources that investors have to pour in. And I'll give an example. One of the examples that we often use when looking at what kind of a model or what kind of a sector we want to create, we often look at microfinance, which is one of the most scaled sectors that has its pros and cons, obviously, in terms of inclusive finance. But certainly one of the things that helped that to scale was appropriate regulation, a decrease in risk in some cases that then allowed investors to come in. And so that's the kind of environment that we want to create. I can give you an example. In India, for example, one of the things that India did as regulation was to mandate banks to keep a certain portfolio for financing, for inclusive financing and for financing the poor, which opened the floodgates in 2007. Obviously, that was not very well regulated, not very well self-regulated in India, and in 2010 we saw it kind of implode. But that points to the importance both in what kind of an effect the government can have in helping the private sector, helping impact investors and those beyond really pour in their investment, and at the same time the role that government needs to play in making sure that it's well regulated and working with the private sector to ensure that. The last thing I would want to comment on is the delegate from Singapore did ask whether or not some of these solutions can be global in nature. And again, I'd point to the idea of the fact that, we're not focused on building a firm, and I don't think anyone in this sector that's a practitioner should be focused on only building their firm, but rather looking at how they can build a sector. And again, I point to microfinance, where Professor Yunus, for example, did not look to create a Grameen bank that would scale across all of the world, but rather help to create a group lending model that worked on the social capital of small communities to be able to then push forward and be tweaked into whichever format was required within each country. And similarly, when we started first with looking at how can we create a global model of solid waste management in conjunction with partners from Peru, in conjunction with partners from Bangladesh, and even looking at models as far ranging from Egypt to Zambia to figure out what could be a globally adaptable model that can then be tweaked to meet the local conditions, still be profitable, and still be impactful in the social and economic and environmental metrics.
Mr. Gupta, thank you. And I think this concludes our discussion today. First of all, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for a robust discussion today. Mr. Paul McMillan, Mr. Gupta, Ms. Ismail, Mr. Reagan, and Mr. Verbeek. Thank you all. And now I'd like to give back the floor to Ambassador Diallo, Chair of the Second Committee.
Merci, Madame la Modératrice.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Ambassador Nestor Storio, President of ECOSOC, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. After a very interesting and insightful debate that's just concluded, I'd like to thank in particular the eminent experts who participated, and of